Hello and welcome to COGGS discussion. I'm Shreya, and with us we have Mr. Giorgio Cafiero. Mr. Cafiero is the CEO of the Gulf State Analytics Geopolitical Risk Consultancy based in Washington, D.C., and adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University. Mr. Cafiero is joining us from Miami, Florida. Thank you, sir, for joining us. So let's start with our today's discussion. Has the former Syrian director, Assad's fall, weakened the axis of resistance? Is it also a defeat of Russia and Iran?
There's no doubt that the fall of Bashar al-Assad's government on December 8th constitutes a huge setback to Iran and, by extension, the entire Iran-led axis of resistance. For many, many years, Syria played an important role in this coalition of state and non-state actors that were linked to Iran. Now that the Assad government has fallen and there is a transition to a post-Ba'athist political order in Syria, the axis of resistance is going to be facing immense challenges in this upcoming period. The de facto leader of Syria, Ahmed al-Shara, also known as Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, has made it quite clear that he disdains Iran and the role that Iran has played in Syria for a long time, as well as the role played by various militia groups that were backed by Iran for many years. We don't know quite yet how the HTS-led administration in Syria and Iran will have relations. It seems very clear that the new political order in Damascus is going to be much more aligned with Turkey, much more interested in having partnerships with the Sunni Gulf Arab monarchies, not Iran. So it remains to be seen what Iran will do to try to advance and protect its interests, its vested interests in Syria. I do think it is important, however, to keep in mind that while HTS controls Damascus and the other major cities in Syria, HTS certainly does not control all of Syria. And if HTS can get to a point where it establishes an effective government that maintains total control over all of Syria, that might not be a moment that we get to anytime soon. Within this context, I think the Iranians will have ample opportunity to possibly take advantage of any chaos that might possibly ensue in Syria when the state is rather weak and there are a lot of divisions and different types of conflicts taking place between different groups inside Syria amid this very delicate transition period. When it comes to Russia, I think the Russians are in a better position than the Iranians to secure their interests inside Syria during the post-Assad period. It's important to keep in mind that the HTS-led administration is seeking stability at home and legitimacy on the international stage. The government led by al-Shara is trying to present itself to regional and global powers as if it is a moderate and pragmatic government and one that deserves to be legitimized in the eyes of major regional and global players. Given that Russia sits on the UN Security Council as a permanent member, this makes the relationship with Russia particularly important to HTS. Of course, there is a tremendous amount of baggage given the fact that Russia was a close ally of the Assad regime for decades, and the Russians did a lot to help the Syrian government led by Assad crush rebel forces, with Moscow obviously intervening militarily back in 2015. But I think the HTS-led administration in Damascus is approaching international relations in a manner that is very pragmatic rather than emotional. And we see some engagement between Moscow and HTS. And there are other sources of leverage that the Russians have as well that I think Vladimir Putin's government can use to try to minimize the setbacks to Russian interests in the wake of Assad's fall from power. So, in sum, I think both Iran and Russia are going to try to make the most of this difficult situation, difficult from Tehran and Moscow's perspective. But I think the Russians will be in a better position to secure some sort of strategic foothold in Syria as the country moves forward into the post-Assad future.
So moving ahead, how do you assess the political transition of Syria and how the regional powers reacting to this development?
Well, first of all, I think given how rapidly the Assad regime melted away once the HTS-led offensive began in late November, I think many in the region were caught off guard. I think many around the world were caught off guard, including some of the most renowned experts on Syria who have been paying close attention to the situation in the country ever since the conflict erupted in 2011. It's very clear that Bashar al-Assad never won the Syrian civil war. He had survived the Syrian civil war, but I think many analysts made the mistake of thinking that he had actually won the conflict. In any event, given that many policymakers in the region were caught off guard by how quickly the regime fell, I think many of the governments in the Middle East are approaching the situation in Syria cautiously. There are certainly concerns about the nature of HTS and the nature of other groups that are poised to have influence in post-Assad Syria. A number of Arab states have huge concerns about the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist organizations and causes, big concerns that HTS's rise to power in Syria might embolden other Islamist or possibly jihadist groups in the Middle East. So that's a big concern. Obviously, as we have seen since October 7th, 2023, armed conflicts in the Middle East tend to be very contagious. So I think many of the governments in the region are certainly concerned about developments in Syria playing out violently and chaotically in manners that can fuel instability beyond Syria. A lot of concern about possible spillover effects into Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, possibly into the Gulf. So I think most governments in the region are hoping that Syria will have a smooth transition and that if there is violence in the country, that it will be, well, there is some violence in the country and hoping that it will be contained and hoping that there will be successful mitigation of the violence to prevent it from spreading across international borders. Nonetheless, at the same time, I think most of the Arab states in the neighborhood have been pragmatic, regardless of what they may think about HTS and the ideology of HTS. They have decided to engage the new government in Syria. We've seen delegations from different Arab states going to Damascus. I think, in short, Arab states are going to try to make the most of the situation and to try to find ways to secure influence in post-Assad Syria. But at the same time, I think, as I said a moment ago, for the most part, I think policymakers throughout the wider Arab world are sort of in a wait and see moment where they want to observe the actions taken by the new authorities in Damascus and make decisions based upon their actions rather than their pledges and their statements and the rhetoric. And I would say for the most part, this also applies to Western governments too. I think obviously Well, in Washington, the policymakers had no love for Bashar al-Assad and his government. They certainly see some opportunity for Syria to move in a direction that is more amenable to the geopolitical interests of the United States, given that the new Syrian government will not be an ally, will probably, we can say very confidently, probably not be one of Iran's allies. I think many in Washington are thrilled about the possibility of Syria being detached from Iran. But at the same time, there are many concerns that policymakers have in Washington. Certainly, so many open questions about the way in which HTS is going to govern, questions about what groups in Syria who oppose HTS are going to do, and how HTS might deal with opposition to its rule in the country. There's obviously a U.S. military presence in northeastern Syria, and the U.S. is allied with the PKK-linked YPG, and how YPG and HTS are going to interact, and what role YPG is going to have in the post-Assad Syria is a very, very delicate question, and it's going to be very challenging for the new government in Syria to deal with that issue. So I think policymakers in Washington want to see how those dynamics play out. This is to say absolutely nothing about the fact that in less than 1 month, we have a new administration coming to power in Washington. As we remember from Trump's first term, he approached Syria in manners that were very incoherent, very messy, very dysfunctional. If his administration is going to continue to be incoherent and dysfunctional the second time around when it comes to foreign policy towards Syria, that's going to add many new layers of confusion and uncertainty. So there are so many unknown variables to contend with right now. And I think many governments in the region and on the international level are just simply observing right now to try to see how things play out. But at the same time, all these different actors will probably try to be rather opportunistic and try to push Syria in directions that serve their own country's national interests.
Do you think Ahmad al-Shara, better known as Abu Muhammad al-Jani, is capable of retaining the power and bringing back the stability and negotiation with other powers?
Well, this is a really good question, and it's very tough to make a prediction one way or the other. I think al-Shara has demonstrated that above anything else, he is a pragmatic figure, and we can say that based on how HTS was governing in Idlib and how HTS has been acting since the Assad government fell on December 8th. I think that HTS understands that a hardline Salafist ideology is one that will be rejected by the majority of Syrians. And if the HTS-led government is to be seen as popular and legitimate in the eyes of most Syrians, it will be necessary to govern in a much more moderate manner. At the same time, there are probably elements within HTS and certain supporters of HTS who do not want to see this move toward moderation, and they may break off from HTS in the future or try to put pressure on al-Shara and other power brokers in Damascus to retain the hardline ideology of HTS, going back to its days as Jabhat al-Nusra, which was the Syrian offshoot of al-Qaeda. So how al-Shara and those around him are going to strike these balancing acts is unclear. I think, as I said earlier, his focus right now is on bringing stability to Syria and trying to get as many actors on the international stage as possible to view the government that he is the de facto leader of as legitimate. He wants to get the West, specifically Washington, to delist HTS. He wants to get the sanctions on Syria removed. so that Syria can begin the very long process and the very difficult process of redeveloping the country. It's going to take many years, probably decades, for Syria to rebuild. But the sooner that the new government of Syria can get the sanctions lifted, stabilize the country, and begin attracting foreign direct investment, then the sooner this process can get started. I don't think that al-Shara and those around him are interested in settling scores with Israel. I think the focus is on stabilizing Syria and redeveloping the country and moving forward with reconstruction. The problem, however, is if the Israeli aggression against Syria continues or if it intensifies, there will probably come a point in which the post-Assad government will have to respond to Israel. And then there's also some points to consider about Turkey's direct involvement in Syria and the potential for a confrontation between Turkey and Israel that could play out in some very complicated ways, could certainly undermine the prospects for stability and regrowth in Syria. How al-Shara is going to navigate these dynamics is unclear. We can say for sure it will be very, very complicated, and it will have a huge impact on the ways in which Washington and other Western powers and also powers in the neighborhood look at the post-Assad government in Syria. I apologize for sort of being vague, but I just want to always leave open a lot of room so we can appreciate the extent to which there are so many unknown variables and so much uncertainty that we have to consider right now. But again, I think it's just important to stress that the new authorities in Damascus seem to be acting very pragmatically, and we need to understand this within the context of them seeking to create a government that both Syrians inside of Syria, as well as actors throughout the international community, see as legitimate. This is very important to the process of setting up a functional government that receives support internally and externally.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cafiero, for giving us your invaluable insights. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much.